I built a custom Pokemon generator that uses the ChatGPT API to create a custom bio and the DALL-E API to create an image from that bio, all within Next.js using API endpoints, giving us the ability to generate as many custom Pokemon as we could possibly handle. Hey team, I'm Colby Fayok. I make weekly web dev tutorials helping you to solve real problems with the tools of the web. And today we're going to look at OpenAI, including using OpenAI SDKs like ChatGPT and the image creation using DALL-E. ChatGPT has hit the world by storm, and it's not stopping, with new models constantly coming out that improves on the last. Not to mention DALL-E and image generation, which gives us a whole new range of capabilities for working with visual media. So let's see how we can pull in the OpenAI APIs using the SDKs into a Next.js application, where we'll use API routes, which will give us a consistent and secure location in order to make those requests to the OpenAI API. To get started, you can follow along right with me by checking out this demo starter, where you can find the link in the description, where it's just going to give us a simple Pokemon card UI. So diving in, I have my basic card UI, and I have this button where if I click generate, what I want to happen is I want to go off and make that request to OpenAI, and I want to be able to return those results into my card. Now, we're not going to cover any of the card UI here, but if you want to take a look at what's going on, I just have a bunch of nested spans just to get some of that data on the page. I have some styles inside of card.module.scss, but again, we're not really going to cover this, but you can check it out. It's all inside of the repository if you want. But for now, in order to actually trigger the capability, we first need to set up OpenAI. If this is your first time using OpenAI API, you can head over to openai.com, head over to the developers tab. We can go to overview, where we're going to be met with all the different options that we have for the SDK. But ultimately, we want to sign up, where we can sign up for a free account. It even has a free trial with some credits. Later, if you need to go past that, you can enter your billing information. But otherwise, we just simply need to first get started by logging in. Now, once you are logged in, you can come up here and click on the little avatar where you can select View API Keys from the menu, where I currently have 2 generated API keys, and we can go ahead and create another one. But keep in mind that this is a secret key. You do not want to share this API key, otherwise you open yourself up to abuse. So make sure you don't commit this or send this in any kind of code to other people. But once I click Create New Secret Key, it's going to give me that key where I can make it available inside of my app, where in the root of the project, I'm going to create a new file called .env.local, and inside I'm going to create a new variable of OpenAI API key, and let's set that to that new key that we generated. Again, that's a secret key. I'm going to delete this right after, so don't even try to use it. But heading back into the documentation, we can select the API reference, where we can see right at the top how we can get started is by installing the OpenAI SDK. So we're going to copy this npm install command. I'm going to paste that right into my terminal, and it's going to install that package. And if we start to scroll down on this introduction page, we can see how we can actually authenticate requests. We even see an example of a node package configuration, but we'll be able to see this as we're using specific SDKs, so don't necessarily worry about this yet. Now, in order to use OpenAI, we first need our environment to use it in, and that's going to be serverless functions using API routes. So inside of the pages directory, under pages API, I'm going to create a new folder, and let's call that Pokemon. I'm going to then create a new file inside that called create.js. I'm going to actually copy and paste the hello.js file into here. One thing I'm going to do, which is important, is to make sure that this is an async function, as we're going to use async await inside of this, or if you prefer to use thens, you can also avoid that. But anyways, make sure you use async if you're following along with me. But what we just did is created a new API route under API/Pokemon/create. If I open up that API route inside of my browser by going to API Pokemon Create, we can see that it gives me that sample JSON response. And what we're going to want to do is whenever somebody hits this API endpoint, we want to generate a new Pokemon. So this is where we're going to start configuring our OpenAI SDK. But what we want to do is actually use the SDK that we're going to be using to generate that Pokemon. And we're going to be using the Chat SDK. So under the API reference, we can find Chat in the sidebar, where in particular, we're going to use the create chat completion interface. And we can see that we have an example of that request on the side here, which for all intents and purposes, we're just going to go ahead and copy. So to start, I'm going to copy the actual configuration of it, which is going to be this top bit, including the require statement, the setup of the configuration, and actually the instance of OpenAI API. I'm going to paste that right at the top of my create endpoint, where now I have a new instance of OpenAI API. It's even referencing that OpenAI API key that we created inside of .env local so that we can start using this SDK. Now going back to the documentation, I want to actually now use that method in order to invoke the SDK. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that bit and paste that at the top of my handler function, where what we can see happening is it's just going to invoke that create chat completion method. It's going to use the model of GPT 3.5 Turbo, and it's going to pass in a message as the user, which is going to prompt a response. Now, in our case, we don't want to just say hello world. What we're trying to do is create a new Pokemon. So I'm going to update this message to create a new Pokemon character. Now, in order to see this work, I can take this completion and I'm just going to console log it out so that we can see it in the terminal. When I refresh the endpoint inside of my browser, it might take a few seconds to load, but we'll see the normal response. But we should now see that we have a new data object inside of our terminal, which is going to be that completion. Now, it's only going to show us a limited amount of that data, so we need to update that console log to drill down into that actual data. Now, before we do that, just want to point out that because that request can sometimes take over 10 seconds, it might go beyond the serverless function limit of 10 seconds, which you see with providers like Vercel and Netlify on their free tier. If you're using services like Vercel, you can use edge functions, which don't have that limit, but we're not going to cover that here. Or you can just upgrade to the Pro plan, or if you're already on the Pro plan, you're all set. So I'm going to update this to completion.data.choices. And once that finishes loading, we can actually see that we just generated a completely new Pokemon called Aquashark, which is of type Water Shark. Now, just pausing here for a second, I think it's absolutely amazing. With just that little bit of code, we were able to generate a completely custom Pokemon. While this example is just for fun, think about all the practical use cases we can use in order to generate this kind of custom data. But moving on, one issue with this data is it might be inconsistent between all the different times that we request it. We're not giving any particular order to the chat prompt. We're not telling it specifically what attributes we want or need in order to fulfill our card UI. So the way that we can handle this is we can update our prompt here inside of content to include all the attributes that we need. And I'm not going to sit here and write it all out, but what I'm going to do is copy and paste this in, where I'm going to say create a new Pokemon character with the following attributes. And I'm going to paste in this list here where we have a name, a description, a short description. We have the type of Pokemon, we have the category, hit points, we have all the different attributes, including an attack and a power. That way we have enough data to actually give all the attributes we need for this Pokemon, including an appearance, so that we can actually see or read what the Pokemon is supposed to look like. Hint, we'll use that appearance later to connect it to DALL-E. But now let's save this and see what it looks like. Once I get my completion results back, we can see that it has a lot of new data in it. I have my name, my short description. I have all the specific attributes that I wanted and needed in order to take advantage of that data. Now, the next issue with this is all just a bunch of text with a new line for every single attribute. I really don't want to write a regex to try to read all these different attributes. So how can we handle this? Well, thinking about how we're already communicating with ChatGPT in order to get this response, what we can do in addition to this is just add another line where we're going to say, format the response in JSON. And just like that, it's now returning a JSON string that we can parse and use in our app. But okay, one more nitpicky thing where it's a potentially app-breaking issue where this isn't going to give me the same exact attributes every single time. Particularly, I've seen issues with the length in inches or even using camel case as opposed to snake case. So what we can do is actually tell it to format it in an existing object pattern that we pass in. So let's say format the response in the following JSON object. And I did a little preparation for this and I created that object so that we don't have to type it out by hand. It's going to match the card API or UI that I already created. So under data Pokemon, I have this Pokemon attributes. So we're going to import that and use that. So at the top, I'm going to import const Pokemon attributes. That autocomplete isn't helping me. It's requiring from at data/Pokemon. I'm going to get rid of that extra curly brace there, but I'm going to say Pokemon attributes. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pass it in as JSON stringify my Pokemon attributes, and autocomplete actually helped out there. So now whenever I get my response, I can be sure that it's going to be in that consistent pattern for how it's formulating all that data that I requested. So now let's return all that data in our endpoint so that we can use it in our application. So we're going to specify this completion data, and we're just going to grab the first one since we're only ever going to have that one message inside of that completion array. And then we're going to grab that content and we're going to parse it and pass that back. So just to help me out here, we're going to say we're going to grab the first item of that choices array. We're inside message content. That's the object that we're going to use in order to parse and grab our data. So let's say constant result is equal to that. I'm going to wrap it in JSON parse. And ideally you can have some kind of error handling on this, but for now I'm just going to move forward with this. And actually, I'm going to call this attributes. And what I'm going to do is just simply pass back the attributes as my property right into that response. And now when I reload the endpoint, we can see I have my new beautiful custom Pokemon attributes readily available to me. Now, just as a quick note, the reason why I'm able to load this endpoint in the browser is because it's currently a GET request. If I was accepting a body for this request and I didn't have any kind of error handling or changing of the format on it, it would give me an error and I wouldn't be able to debug that. But because we're using it purely as a GET right now, I'm able to easily debug it right inside of the browser. But now I think we're ready to use this endpoint inside of our application. So back inside of my app, I'm going to find this generate button and I'm going to say on click, where I'm going to invoke an on generate function. So I'm going to head back to the top and I'm going to define that function for on generate. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say prevent default so that I can actually prevent it from happening. And then inside of here is where we're going to want to kick off that process of actually creating the Pokemon. Now, before I do that, I want to be able to save that Pokemon data so that I can actually use it in the application. So the first thing we're actually going to need is to import use state from React. And then I'm going to set up a new instance of that state. So I'm going to say constant attributes is set attributes, and I'm going to set that equal to the use state instance. But now let's actually request that custom Pokemon. So inside of onGenerate, we can see that it's even auto completing it for me. Let's say I want to await a fetch request of this API where we can see that I didn't define an async function. So I want to make sure this is an async onGenerate function, but I'm going to get the results from this equal to that. At the end of the fetch, I'm going to chain on a then where I'm going to say response to JSON so that I don't have to do that in a new line or in a separate instance. What I'm going to have is this results object that's going to contain my new attributes. So what do I want to do? I want to set those new attributes. I'm going to set attributes with results.attributes, which is working beautifully. Thank you, Copilot. And it's going to make sure that as soon as that request comes in, it's going to set those attributes for me. Now, finally, in order to see it inside of the UI, while we could take a second here to console log it out, I know ahead of time that the card component is already set up for this. So I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to pass in, I'm going to find that card component. I'm going to pass the attributes right into that component so we can see our results. Now, heading back to the application, I'm going to go ahead and click that generate button. We can see that that create request was kicked off inside of our network tab, and it's going to take a few seconds as the OpenAI API does take a little bit in order to generate that response. But we can see once it does come back, the first thing we notice is that it's a new color because it actually has a type where we're mapping that type inside of the card component to a set of colors and icons so that we can have something that looks somewhat resemblant of an actual Pokemon card. So we have our friend Dracohex or Dracohex, however you want to pronounce it, as well as his attacks such as Hex Fury, his power, six-headed strike. We have a new Pokemon completely generated from scratch using that ChatGPT API prompt. Now, in the event that you want to generate a new one, we can click that generate button and we can see that a new request is kicked off, but we can see we still have that old data. Now, as we start to align the image that we're going to hit in a second, we want to make sure we reset that state. So inside of our code, before we actually make that request, let's also make sure that we're setting our attributes to undefined or null or whatever your preference is so that it resets everything before it creates that new set. But now once I generate a new Pokemon, and then try to create another one, we can see as soon as I click generate, it's going to reset that and kick off the new request to give me my new buddy of Glimmer. If you scroll down below the card, you'll also notice that we have a backstory attribute, and we can also update this in order to make sure that we have a little bit of a story behind our new character. This data is already on the attributes. It's going to be available at attributes.backstory. So what we can do is down wherever we find backstory right here, we can say if we have attributes backstory, and we're going to then pass in the paragraph tag where we're going to plop in that backstory. I'm going to get rid of the optional chaining since at that point it's not necessary. And we can see because we're still maintaining that state, our backstory was able to plop right in where apparently Glimmer was born of a rare and special occurrence within the forest. So now that we have our new Pokemon, we want to see our new Pokemon, where we might not ever see our friend Glimmer again since it's a completely generated custom Pokemon, but we can see for the next one that we generate what that Pokemon actually looks like based on the appearance that we're getting in the attributes. So we're going to do something really similar to what we just did with the create endpoint, where we're going to create a new endpoint to call the Image API. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make the request. We're going to actually use the attributes to pass into that request. And then finally, we're going to set that in state so we can use that image. So getting started, I'm going to go ahead and clone this create endpoint and let's just call it image. And inside, the first thing I can do is clean up all that completion code since we're not going to use that specific completion code. We're not going to use these Pokemon attributes, but we're going to use the same OpenAI configuration, so we can leave that part as is. Now for this one, we're going to use the images SDK. In particular, we're going to use create image, where we can see that it looks somewhat similar to what we just did, but we're going to use the create image method. We're going to pass in a prompt and as well as some other configuration that we're not really going to go over in this video, but then we can pass in a prompt where we're going to be able to get that response. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that create image method. I'm going to paste it in right at the top of that handler function, where just like we did before, let's now console log out those results. And I need to make sure I remove these attributes, otherwise that's going to error since it doesn't exist. But if I hit that endpoint in my browser like we were doing for the create endpoint, we can see that we're going to get that response, and we're going to see the data that lives inside of data.data. So let's console log that part out so we can actually see the results. So I'm going to update the response to data.data. And once the response comes in, we can see we actually get 2 images. So we're only going to ever use the first one. Maybe you can build out some kind of UI picker so that you can use one of the 2 images available, but we're going to use this first one. And if I open this up in my browser, we can see that it generated a completely new picture of this baby otter. And while this otter is adorably cute, we actually want a Pokemon. So I'm going to say create an image of a new Pokemon. And because we're going to be using this inside of a card UI, I'm going to say with no background objects or text. And let's see our results. If I open this up, we can see that we have a new Pokemon. I don't know the name of this Pokemon because we didn't specify that. But now let's actually create a new image for a Pokemon that we specify. The way that we're going to do this is inside of our actual application, we're going to pass in a body using attributes.appearance. That way we can post that as the body. We can get that inside of the image endpoint and actually use it to pass into the prompt. So at the top of my handler function, I'm going to start off by saying constant body is equal to json.parse request.body. And then I'm going to say I want to grab the description from, or rather equals from the body. And if the body doesn't exist, let's just add an empty object just in case. But ultimately, I want to pass this description, which is going to be its appearance, into this endpoint. So I'm going to make this template literal tags. And then I'm going to say from this description, I'm going to pass in that description so it can dynamically add it to the prompt. Now, like I was alluding to before, now we're not going to be able to actually test this in the browser since we're trying to grab the body of the request, but now we can actually just use it inside of our application. But before we actually dive into the app itself, we need to return those results. So I'm going to say my image is going to be, that's pretty much it, response data, where we're going to grab that first item from the array so I can get rid of that console log. But now I pretty much want to do the same thing that I did when requesting the attributes to be created. So I'm going to first create a new instance of state. Let's call that image and set image, where inside of onGenerate, I want to now make that request. So I'm going to say constant, and I know I'm going to destructure my image based off of what we're returning. I'm going to destructure that image from await fetch API /Pokemon /image. And now we need to pass in this second argument inside of the fetch API so that we can define that, first of all, it is going to be using the post method since we want to pass in a body, but then we're going to use the body itself where we want to pass in the description. And this is actually not auto-completed correctly. We want to pass in results attributes appearance, because specifically we want to pass in a description that's about how the Pokemon looks, not just about the Pokemon generally. So we're going to pass in that appearance that we're going to have inside those attributes. And finally, since we now have that image, we're going to use the set image method, where I'm going to just simply set our method or our image. Now, one thing we were doing before with our Pokemon create is resetting those attributes. So we're going to do the same thing, and we probably want to reset the image similarly as soon as we kick off the generation request. But finally, before we can actually see what this looks like, we need to actually use it. So we're going to take this image object. I'm going to head down to our card, and similar to our attributes, I'm already expecting this in the card UI. So I'm going to just pass in that image as is, which is an object including a URL property. But now I'm going to click the generate button to kick it off. We can see create finished and image kicked off as soon as it was finished, where we now have Flarabbit, and we actually have our Flarabbit image inside of our Pokemon card, as well as all the attributes defining our new custom Pokemon. Again, this is a fun example, but this gets me excited. So let's generate a new one, where this time we get Arendrak with the cute little flowers on it. And it's just amazing that we were able to generate this with just that little bit of code using those endpoints and the OpenAI SDK. Now, where do we go from here? Maybe you want to define a specific type of Pokemon that gets created and have a little select drop down so that somebody can select exactly the type we want rather than just generating a new one each time. Now, to do that, you can pass that value right into the creation endpoint, similar to what we're doing with the description on image. That way, you can take that type, that custom type that's specified, and pass it into the prompt. Or more importantly, maybe you want to add some security around this and require people to log in so that you know that people aren't abusing it, or at least you can cut off or set limits based off of the people that are using it. While it's definitely possible we're in a bit of a hype wave with AI hitting the scene, there's a lot of practical use cases for the technology that we're seeing right now. And it's really exciting how we can empower ourselves as developers with tools like this in my video from last week of the Copilot CLI. If you want to take this a step further and actually add that authentication to the app, check out my video passwordless authentication and log in Next.js with Clerk. Or if you want to learn how to save those Pokemon creation results in local storage so that you can grab it next time, or just see all the different Pokemon you created, check out my video, Save State to Local Storage and Persist on Refresh with React.js. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.